I don't tell jokes. I tell anecdotes and lies. Anyway, this is a joke. And it's not a joke, it's a story. It's a true story. It really happened.
For decades, George Burns made millions of people laugh with his sharp humor, timeless charm, and unforgettable stories from Hollywood's golden age. But when the legendary comedian passed away, one shocking detail left fans completely stunned. Instead of leaving his massive fortune to family, friends, or famous Hollywood stars, George Burns chose one unexpected person to inherit it all. The decision sparked rumors, questions, and endless curiosity for years. Who was this mysterious person, and why did George Burns trust them with everything he built over a lifetime? Join us in this video as we reveal the details. The fortune nobody expected. By July 1994, George Burns was already 98 years old, but he still refused to slow down. Then, one terrible accident changed everything. While at his Beverly Hills home, George slipped in the bathtub and smashed into a soap dish, badly cutting his head. At first, it seemed like a painful fall, but once doctors at Cedars-Sinai examined him, they noticed his speech was slurred. Emergency surgery followed almost immediately to remove fluid building around his brain. The accident forced George to cancel a major performance at Caesar's Palace, a show fans had waited over a year to see. Tickets had sold out long before the date arrived. For many people close to him, that cancellation felt like the end of an era. George Burns had spent more than 80 years performing, making audiences laugh through radio, television, film, and live shows. After the fall, he never truly recovered enough to return to the stage. But even as his body weakened, his humor never disappeared. Friends who visited him during recovery said he still cracked jokes from his hospital bed. Comedy legend Milton Berle often stopped by, and George would keep everyone laughing despite the pain. He even continued dictating new joke ideas because writing comedy made him feel alive. It was almost impossible for him to stop being George Burns. By December 1995, his health had declined badly. Plans for a huge public celebration for his 100th birthday quietly changed into a small private gathering inside his home. George was too weak to attend the official events people had prepared for him. Still, he welcomed close friends, passed around cigars, and smiled through the evening. At one point, he jokingly told guests he would see them all again at 101. On January 20th, 1996, George Burns officially turned 100 years old, becoming one of the few entertainers ever to reach that milestone. Less than 2 months later, on March 9, 1996, he died at home from cardiac arrest. Then came the moment that stunned Hollywood. Later that year, on October 10th, his personal belongings were auctioned off at Sue's in Beverly Hills. The estate was valued at more than $30 million. There were 266 different items up for sale, including scripts, awards, personal papers, and even his famous cigars. Fans expected family members to inherit most of his fortune. Instead, George Burns left nearly everything to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, the United Jewish Fund, and the Motion Picture Fund. Sandra and Ronnie received nothing. To outsiders, the decision felt cold and shocking. But people who truly knew George understood something deeper. Near the end of his life, giving back had become more important to him than holding on to wealth. The hospitals, charities, and entertainment foundations he supported represented the people and communities that had carried him through a lifetime in show business. And even after his death, his influence never faded. Comedians who came after him openly admitted how much they learned from his style. Jerry Seinfeld once said George's book Living It Up helped shape the way he writes jokes. George's quiet delivery, perfect timing, and straight-man comedy style became the foundation for generations of comedians. People remembered the cigars, the glasses, and the martinis. But doctors and friends later believed the real secret behind George Burns's long life was much simpler. He stayed mentally sharp, constantly social, and never stopped finding reasons to laugh. But how did everything begin for George Burns's journey? Keep watching to find out. From a poor New York kid to a comedy legend. Long before George Burns became one of the most famous comedians in America, he was just a poor boy named Nathan Birnbaum growing up in New York City. Born on January 20th, 1896, he was the ninth of 12 children in a struggling immigrant family. His parents, Hadassah and Eliezer Birnbaum, had come to America from what is now Poland, hoping for a better life. But life in New York's crowded neighborhoods was difficult, and money was always short. George's father worked pressing coats and sometimes served as a substitute cantor at the local synagogue. Then tragedy struck the family during the influenza epidemic of 1903. George was only 7 years old when his father died from the flu at just 47 years old. Suddenly, the family lost its main source of income, and young Nathan had no choice but to grow up fast. At an age when most children were playing outside, he was already working small jobs to help feed the family. He shined shoes, delivered errands, and sold newspapers on busy New York streets. But while working at a candy shop making syrup in the basement, something unexpected happened that changed his life forever. One day, Nathan and a few other boys started singing harmony together while they worked. A mail carrier named Lou Farley overheard them and loved what he heard. Soon, the boys were performing anywhere they could find an audience. They called themselves the Pee Wee Quartet and sang on ferry boats, street corners, saloons, and even brothels. Sometimes people tossed coins into their hats. Other times, people actually stole from the hats instead. Years later, George laughed while remembering those rough early days. That was the moment he realized entertainment could become his future. As a teenager, George worked around vaudeville theaters and Nickelodeons, learning how show business worked from the ground up. He even operated curtains at one theater owned by Frank Seiden's family, unknowingly standing close to the entertainment world he would later dominate. Around age 14, he picked up another habit that would become part of his image forever: smoking cigars. When World War I began in 1917, George was drafted into the United States Army, but his terrible eyesight kept him from passing the physical exam. Around that same time, he decided to change his name, wanting to hide his Jewish background in an industry where discrimination was common. Nathan Birnbaum became George Burns. According to George, he borrowed George from his brother and Burns from a coal company he used to steal coal from as a kid. At first, success did not come easily. George spent years performing with different dance partners and comedy acts, always searching for the right fit. He even married one dance partner, Hannah Siegel, because her family refused to let her tour with him unless they were married. The marriage lasted only 26 weeks before ending after the tour finished. Then, in 1923, George met the woman who would completely change his life and career, Gracie Allen. Gracie was young, funny, and completely different from anyone he had worked with before. The chemistry between them was instant. George later admitted that audiences finally noticed his talent only after he partnered with Gracie. In his own words, "I did have a talent, and I was married to her for 38 years. The two married in 1926 and quickly became one of the biggest comedy teams in America. Together, Burns and Allen moved into films during the late 1920s and 1930s, appearing in successful comedy movies alongside major stars like Bing Crosby, W.C. Fields, Jack Benny, Fred Astaire, and Bob Hope. But one strange Hollywood decision quietly changed movie history forever. In 1938, Paramount originally planned a film that would pair Burns and Allen with Bing Crosby. But producers eventually decided the comedy style did not fit George and Gracie's act. The script was rewritten, replacing them with Crosby and Bob Hope instead. That movie became Road to Singapore in 1940, launching the famous Road film series that turned into one of Hollywood's biggest comedy franchises. Even though George Burns missed out on that opportunity, his own career was only getting started. How did a poor kid become a comedy legend overnight? Stay tuned to find out. The radio show that changed everything. By the early 1930s, George Burns and Gracie Allen were already building a strong name for themselves in theaters and films. But radio was becoming the biggest form of entertainment in America, and the couple knew they had to find a way into people's homes. At first, they appeared on the radio as comic relief for bandleader Guy Lombardo. The chemistry between George and Gracie immediately stood out. Still, not everyone appreciated their comedy interruptions. Years later, George shared a funny letter in his memoir, The Third Time Around. A college fraternity had complained that its weekly dance parties kept getting interrupted by Burns and Allen routines on the radio. Instead of dancing, students were stopping to listen to the comedy sketches. George found it hilarious because it proved people were paying attention. Soon, Burns and Allen earned a radio show of their own. Their first official broadcast aired on February 15, 1932, and it quickly became something different from anything else on radio at the time. Rather than relying on one long story, the show used short comedy sketches, connected together through George and Gracie's strange but lovable relationship. The style felt fast, unpredictable, and natural, much like the comedy shorts they had already been making in Hollywood. One of the smartest things about the show was how creatively they used publicity. At one point, Gracie's character began searching for her missing brother, and the storyline spilled over into appearances on entirely different radio programs. Listeners had to follow multiple shows just to keep up with the joke. It was one of the earliest examples of a comedy crossover campaign, long before television networks turned the idea into a marketing strategy. In 1935, musician Ferdi Grofé joined the program as musical director, helping shape the sound of the show as its audience continued growing across America. During the early years, George and Gracie pretended to be unmarried on the air, even though listeners already knew they were husband and wife in real life. The show turned Gracie into the center of attention, with several male characters constantly chasing after her. Bandleader Ray Noble regularly flirted with Gracie on air and became famous for saying, "Gracie, this is the first time we've ever been alone." Meanwhile, Artie Shaw and singer Tony Martin also played romantic rivals, competing for her attention. Gracie's character added chaos everywhere she went. She often misunderstood conversations in the funniest ways possible, while George stayed calm and reacted with perfect timing. That contrast became the secret behind their success. But by 1941, audiences had changed. Listeners already knew George and Gracie were married in real life, and the old romantic chase format was beginning to feel outdated. Ratings slowly started slipping. Instead of panicking, George and his writers completely reinvented the entire show. Rather than pretending to be single performers, Burns and Allen now played a married couple dealing with everyday life. The new version focused on neighbors, friendships, gossip, misunderstandings, and life inside their Beverly Hills home. It became one of the earliest true radio sitcoms. The change saved the show. New supporting characters helped create an entire comedy world around George and Gracie. Elvia Allman played Tootsie Sagwell, a desperate spinster constantly chasing romance. Harry and Blanche Morton became the couple's unforgettable neighbors and regular sources of trouble. At different times, actors like Mel Blanc, Bea Benaderet, and Hal March joined the growing cast. Mel Blanc, years before becoming legendary for cartoon voices, played the gloomy, happy postman, whose cheerful catchphrase was always delivered in the saddest possible voice. "Remember, keep smiling." The show also introduced one of its funniest long-running jokes, George's terrible singing voice. Gracie lovingly called him Sugar Throat, even though almost everyone listening knew he could barely sing at all. Audiences loved the gag because George never tried to make himself look perfect. He was willing to be the punchline if it made the scene funnier. Another major addition came from Meredith Willson, who handled the show's music after the format change. Willson played himself on the program as a shy and awkward man around women, adding another layer of comedy. Years later, he would become famous for creating the Broadway musical The Music Man. What made Burns and Allen special was how naturally the comedy flowed. The conversations sounded casual, almost improvised, even though the timing was carefully planned. George often played the straight man, while Gracie wandered into absurd logic that somehow made perfect sense to her. Audiences felt like they were listening to real people rather than actors reading scripts.
And for instance, when I do a script, I do a picture. I know the words because I work very hard at it. And then when the picture is over, if you ask me the next day, it's gone.
The gamble paid off in a massive way. The reinvented program became one of the few classic radio shows ever able to completely change its format and become even more successful afterward. Burns and Allen stayed inside the top 10 ratings for the rest of their radio career. By the late 1940s, they were no longer just entertainers. They were household names. Then another huge opportunity appeared. In 1949, after more than a decade with NBC, George and Gracie decided to return to CBS. the network where they had first become famous during the 1930s. The move happened largely because of their close friend, Jack Benny. Benny had grown frustrated with NBC during contract negotiations and eventually agreed to move his successful program to CBS after network executive William S. Paley convinced him that performers should have more control and respect. Jack Benny then encouraged several major stars to follow him to CBS, including Burns and Allen. That decision would soon change television history, too. By 1950, George Burns and Gracie Allen were preparing to leave radio behind and enter a brand new world. So, how did radio success lead to television immortality? Let's find out. Television made George Burns immortal. When George Burns and Gracie Allen finally moved from radio to television in 1950, America already felt like it knew them personally. Audiences had listened to their voices for nearly 2 decades, followed their jokes every week, and imagined what life inside their home must look like. Television suddenly gave those listeners something new: faces, expressions, reactions, and the feeling that they were sitting inside the Burns household itself. The move changed everything. At first, the George Burns and Gracie Allen show closely copied the old radio format. Episodes still included long comedy scenes mixed with advertisements for sponsor Carnation Evaporated Milk. Announcer Bill Goodwin delivered commercials directly inside the story, just like on radio. But television worked differently. What sounded smooth on the radio sometimes felt slow and awkward on screen. George understood this quickly. So the show slowly transformed into a true television sitcom, separating the commercials from the story and focusing more on the strange but lovable chaos inside George and Gracie's daily lives. That change helped make the program feel modern and natural, and soon it became one of television's biggest successes. One of the smartest ideas George introduced was something audiences had rarely seen before. He constantly broke the fourth wall. While scenes unfolded around him, George would suddenly turn toward the camera and speak directly to viewers at home. He quietly explained what Gracie was planning, warned audiences about trouble ahead, or joked about how ridiculous the situation had become. Later episodes pushed the idea even further. George would walk into another room, turn on a television set, and secretly watch the other characters while they believed he was gone. Then he would return to stop whatever disaster Gracie had accidentally created. The style felt fresh, clever, and years ahead of its time. Meanwhile, the cast around them continued evolving. Several different actors played neighbor Harry Morton throughout the series, including Hal March, John Brown, Fred Clark, and Larry Keating. The rotating role almost became a running joke by itself. After the first season, announcer Bill Goodwin left the show, and George hired radio veteran Harry Von Zell. Von Zell became one of the funniest parts of the series. His confused but loyal character constantly got dragged into Gracie's wild schemes, only to be fired by George over and over again. Viewers loved watching him panic every time Gracie came up with another impossible idea. As the years passed, the line between real life and television became blurrier. George and Gracie's actual children slowly started appearing on the show. Their daughter Sandra mostly appeared through voice parts or tiny scenes, often playing a telephone operator. Their son Ronnie first appeared in smaller roles before joining the regular cast later on. And in classic Burns and Allen fashion, the show never bothered explaining where Ronnie had been all those years. One season, he simply appeared as George and Gracie's son, and everyone acted as though he had always been there. Ronnie's character was originally written as a serious drama student who looked down on his parents' comedy career. He thought their style was silly and old-fashioned. But after the family returned to California from New York in later seasons, Ronnie abandoned his acting dreams, enrolled at USC, and became known mainly for chasing girls. Behind the scenes, George Burns was becoming just as powerful as the television networks themselves. Inspired partly by the success of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz with Desilu Productions, Burns and Allen created their own production company called McCadden Corporation. Named after the street where George's brother lived, the company operated from the General Service studio lot in Hollywood. What started as a way to control their own show quickly expanded into a major television business. McCadden produced several successful series, including The Bob Cummings Show, The People's Choice, Mona McCluskey, and the wildly popular sitcom Mr. Ed, starring a talking horse alongside actor Alan Young. The company even helped produce episodes for their close friend, Jack Benny. But while George's business success kept growing, Gracie's health quietly worsened. By the early 1950s, heart problems had started draining her energy. Performing weekly television shows became exhausting, and deep down, Gracie wanted to retire. The problem was simple. She hated disappointing George. She continued working for years longer than many people realized, because she knew how much performing meant to him. Finally, in 1958, after 8 successful seasons, George agreed to end the George Burns and Gracie Allen show. For millions of fans, it felt like the end of an era. George later tried continuing without her. He created a new sitcom called Wendy and Me, starring Connie Stevens alongside Ron Harper and J. Pat O'Malley. George mostly acted as the narrator, once again speaking directly to viewers and secretly watching the other characters from his apartment window. The setup clearly echoed the old Burns and Allen formula, but without Gracie beside him, something felt missing. The series lasted only 1 season. Then came the deepest heartbreak of George Burns's life. In 1964, Gracie Allen died from a heart attack. George was devastated. Friends later said he never fully recovered emotionally from losing her. Instead of slowing down, he buried himself in work. McCadden continued producing television shows, and George returned to touring theaters, nightclubs, and concert halls across America. Even in his late 60s and 70s, he refused to stop performing. He shared stages with stars like Carol Channing, Jane Russell, and Dorothy Provine. He performed at Carnegie Hall, university campuses, and major theaters, proving he could still command an audience by himself. Then, unexpectedly, his entire career changed again. In 1974, George's close friend, Jack Benny, had been preparing to star in the film version of Neil Simon's The Sunshine Boys, but Benny's health suddenly collapsed. Suffering from pancreatic cancer, he could no longer continue working and asked George to replace him both on a nightclub tour and in the movie itself. George accepted. Just weeks before filming started, he underwent triple bypass surgery. Most people his age would have retired permanently after such an operation. George Burns returned to work almost immediately. Then came the performance that shocked Hollywood. Playing aging vaudeville comedian Al Lewis in The Sunshine Boys, George delivered one of the greatest performances of his career.
For the Best Performance Actor in a Supporting Role, the nominees are George Burns in The Sunshine Boys, and the winner is George Burns.
In 1975, at 80 years old, he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, becoming the oldest Oscar winner in history at that time. Suddenly, George Burns was no longer remembered only as part of a comedy duo. He became a major film star all over again. 2 years later, he reached an even younger audience by starring in the hit movie Oh God, alongside John Denver. George played God as calm, funny, and strangely relatable, wearing a sailor cap and speaking with the same dry humor audiences had loved for decades. The role became iconic. The film's success led to multiple sequels, including Oh God, Book 2, and Oh God, You Devil, where George hilariously played both God and the devil himself. At an age when most entertainers had long disappeared from public life, George Burns somehow became popular all over again. And that was the secret of George Burns. Every time people thought his story was ending, he found another stage waiting for him. But what kept George Burns grounded through fame? Keep watching to find out. The cigars that never left his side. For most people, cigars were just something George Burns smoked on stage. But for George, they became part of who he was. The cigar, the glasses, the calm voice, and the slow smile, all blended together into one unforgettable image that audiences recognized instantly. In many ways, George Burns did not just smoke cigars, he made them part of his identity. And even in death, he refused to be separated from them. When George Burns was buried in 1996, 3 of his favorite cigars were placed beside him. To many people, it sounded strange at first. But for those who truly understood George, the decision made perfect sense. He had spent nearly 70 years with a cigar in his hand. It had followed him through radio, movies, television, sold-out performances, award shows, and lonely nights after the death of his beloved wife, Gracie Allen. George often joked that he was simply preparing for his reunion with Gracie. He believed that wherever he was going next, he should probably bring a few cigars along. It perfectly matched his humor, funny, relaxed, and strangely comforting at the same time. On most days, George smoked somewhere between 10 and 15 cigars. His favorites were El Producto cigars because they stayed lit during performances, which made life easier while working on stage. Over the years, the cigars became so connected to his public image that many fans could not picture him without one. But to George, it was never only about appearance. The cigar became part of his rhythm. It gave him comfort, routine, and something familiar in a business where almost everything constantly changed. Long after old friends passed away and Hollywood transformed around him, George Burns still sat with a cigar in his hand, telling stories and making people laugh. In a way, the cigars represented stability. Even when anti-smoking attitudes started growing stronger across America, George refused to quietly abandon something he genuinely loved. One of the best examples happened at the Hillcrest Country Club in Los Angeles. The club had started considering tougher restrictions on smoking as public opinion changed. But eventually, an exception was made, allowing cigar smoking inside the card room for members over 95 years old. Only one person truly benefited from that rule: George Burns. The moment perfectly captured his personality. George was never aggressive about smoking, and he often said he would stop if it genuinely bothered someone nearby. But he also believed adults should still have the freedom to enjoy simple pleasures without constantly being judged for them. To him, cigars represented more than tobacco. They represented tradition, freedom, relaxation, and the old Hollywood world he came from. At a time when many celebrities tried to distance themselves from smoking, George almost seemed determined to keep the image alive. For cigar lovers across America, he became a symbol of that culture. And somehow, he made it all look classy. People often joked about how a man who smoked so many cigars managed to live to be 100 years old. Doctors pointed to his active social life, constant conversations, sharp memory, and sense of humor as the real reasons behind his long life. George himself never pretended to have the secret formula for aging. He simply enjoyed living. Near the end of his life, George gave what would become one of his final major interviews to Cigar Aficionado. The words he shared sounded simple, but they revealed a lot about the way he viewed life after losing so many friends, co-workers, and loved ones over the decades. "I find you have to take each day as it comes, and be thankful for who's left and whatever you can still do." That sentence carried the wisdom of someone who had lived through nearly an entire century of American entertainment history. Then George added something even more personal. "That's why I'm so grateful that after all these years, there's still a demand for me." Even at the very end, George Burns still sounded amazed that audiences continued loving him. After decades in show business, countless personal losses, and a lifetime spent making others laugh, he never lost his gratitude. And maybe that was the real secret behind George Burns. Not the cigars, not the fame, not the money. It was the fact that he never stopped appreciating the chance to keep living, keep laughing, and keep performing for as long as he possibly could. What legacy did George Burns leave behind in Hollywood? Keep watching to find out. A legacy Hollywood never forgot. Even after his death, George Burns remained one of the most honored entertainers in Hollywood history. He earned 3 separate stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame for motion pictures, television, and live performance. 2 of those stars were placed during the original 1960 installation, while the third was added in 1984 after a new live performance category was created. In 1988, George and Gracie Allen were inducted into the Television Hall of Fame, recognizing the impact they had on American comedy and television history. A street in San Antonio, Texas, was also named after him. His story continued inspiring people long after he was gone. George Burns later became the subject of Say Goodnight, Gracie, a one-man stage play written by Rupert Holmes. So, what do you think about what George Burns did with his fortune? Let us know in the comments section below. In the end, this wasn't just about money or a shocking inheritance. It was about the life of George Burns, the people he loved, and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. While many expected his fortune to stay within the family, George chose to give back to the institutions and causes that stood beside him throughout his incredible journey. And maybe that final decision revealed more about who George Burns truly was than any joke he ever told. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more unbelievable stories behind legendary celebrities.